Hey guys. Um, all right, so we're going to take a look at this first proof here. And so let's just go ahead and before we get into all this stuff, let's dive right into the steps. And so we know that step one is always to mark down our given information. So our given information here is going to be that AC is congruent to EC. So I can mark that right there. And then I also know that I want BC to be congruent to DC. So BC with 2 marks is going to be congruent to DC with 2 marks. Let's make sure that we're keeping the two sets separate from each other. I don't want to just put 1 mark on everything because that's not what it tells us. So now let's take a look at this. So step 2, we always want to come up with our roadmap. What's our final step? And so it wants us to prove that AB is congruent to ED. So let's just go ahead and write that down here. Let's write that we want AB to be congruent to, let's see, it said ED. Okay, so let's write that down here, ED. Now, if we look back up here at our triangle, that's going to be this segment here and then this segment here. Now, this is different because typically we've been asked to prove that 2 triangles are congruent. In this case, we want 2 segments. Now, the rule that we're going to use is going to be a little bit new and different in that if we can prove that that these 2 triangles are congruent, then we can prove that corresponding sides of those 2 triangles are congruent. So for our piece of proof, let's just go ahead and write down here. We'll change back to this. And let's say that our piece of proof is going to be that corresponding, sorry, the handwriting is going to be a little bit messy here. Let's use my finger, corresponding sides are congruent. Okay, so that is congruent. Sorry, that is super sloppy. All right, so, but you guys get the drift. So to prove that corresponding sides are congruent, let's continue with our roadmap. We need to prove that corresponding triangles are congruent. So I'm going to go ahead and right above this. So in order to prove, let's shrink this thing down a little bit. So in order to prove this last step, we need to prove that triangles are congruent. So let's say we need to prove that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEC. DEC. Okay, now I need a piece of evidence for that too. So what's my evidence for that going to be? Now if I look at this, I think it's going to be pretty clear that we're going to have to use side angle side. So let's go ahead and write this down. Side angle side. Okay, now let's shrink that a little bit so we've got plenty of room to write. Okay, now let's go back up to the triangle. Step 3 is to draw in the missing information. So right now I don't have side angle side, but I can draw my marks that'll prove side angle side. Okay, so now if we think about it, okay, I've got side angle side that matches up to a side, an angle, and a side. Okay, so that's all good. So step 4 that we talked about is that we have to, whatever we drew in, we have to write down a step for. So we just said that angle ACB is congruent to angle DCE, angle DCE. Okay, cool. So that's what we drew in. And then, of course, I think that by now it's probably pretty obvious that that's a vertical angle. Vertical angles. All right, good. So I'm going to take that piece there and let's shrink that down a little bit so that it looks nicer there. Okay, and so that's our proof right there, guys. All right. So, and of course, the last thing that we want to do is we want to put in these marks. Which is our final step, right? Our final step was to say that AB is congruent to ED because corresponding sides of congruent triangles are congruent. And so I took out a couple of words there, but you guys kind of get the drift that once I can prove that these 2 triangles are congruent, Then I can prove that any corresponding sides of those triangles are also congruent. And as I go back through and look, I've got pieces of evidence for every single one of my steps. So I've got a piece of evidence for that step, a piece of evidence for that step, and then ultimately I have enough to prove this final piece. All right, there we go.